United States presidents issue executive orders to help offices and agencies of the executive branch manage the operations within the federal government itself. Executive orders have the full force of law when they take authority from a legislative power which grants its power directly to the executive by the Constitution, or are made pursuant to acts of Congress that explicitly delegate to the President some degree of discretionary power. Like both legislative statutes and regulations promulgated by government agencies, executive orders are subject to judicial review, and may be struck down if deemed by the courts to be unsupported by statute or the Constitution. Major policy initiatives require approval by the legislative branch, but executive orders have significant influence over the internal affairs of government, deciding how and to what degree legislation will be enforced, dealing with emergencies, waging wars, and in general fine-tuning policy choices in the implementation of broad statutes. Basis in the United States Constitution. There is no constitutional provision nor statute that explicitly permits executive orders. The term executive power in Article 2, Section 1, Clause 1 of the Constitution refers to the office of President as the executive. He is instructed therein by the Declaration, "Take care that the laws be faithfully executed," made in Article 2, Section 3, Clause 5 of face impeachment. Most executive orders use these constitutional reasonings as the authorization allowing for their issuance to be justified as part of the President's sworn duties, the intent being to help direct officers of the U.S. executive carry out their delegated duties as well as the normal operations of the federal government. The consequence of failing to comply possibly being removal from office. An executive order of the President must find support in the Constitution, either in a clause granting the President specific power, or by a delegation of power by Congress to the President. The Office of the Federal Register is responsible for assigning the executive order a sequential number after receipt of the signed original from the White House and printing the text of the executive order in the Daily Federal Register and Title III of the Code of Federal Regulations. Other types of orders issued by the executive are generally classified simply as administrative orders rather than executive orders. These are typically the following: presidential determination, presidential memorandum, presidential notice. Presidential directives are considered a form of executive order issued by the President of the United States with the advice and consent of a major agency or department found within the executive branch of government. Some types of presidential directives are the following: national security directives, homeland security presidential directives. History and news. With the exception of William Henry Harrison, all presidents beginning with George Washington in 1789 have issued orders that in general terms can be described as executive orders. Initially they took no set form. Consequently, such orders varied as to form and substance. The most famous executive order was by President Abraham Lincoln when he issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863. Political scientist Brian R. Dirk states, the Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order, itself a rather unusual thing in those days. Executive orders are simply presidential directives issued to agents of the executive department by its boss. Until the early 1900s, executive orders went mostly unannounced and undocumented, seen only by the agencies to which they were directed. This changed when the Department of State instituted a numbering scheme in 1907, starting with an order issued on October 20, 1862, by President Abraham Lincoln. The documents that later came to be known as executive orders apparently gained the name from this document, captioned Executive Order Establishing a Provisional Court in Louisiana. President Truman's Executive Order 10,340 in Youngstown, Cheaton Amp Tube Co. v. Sawyer, 343 U.S. 579 placed all steel mills in the country under federal control. This was found invalid because it attempted to make law, rather than clarify or act to further a law put forth by the Congress of the Constitution. Presidents since this decision have generally been careful to cite which specific laws they are acting under when issuing new executive orders. Likewise, when presidents believe their authority for issuing an executive order stems from within the powers outlined in the Constitution, the order will simply proclaim, "Under the authority vested in me by the Constitution." Instead, wars have been fought upon executive order, including the 1999 Kosovo War during Bill Clinton's second term in office. However, all such wars have had authorizing resolutions from Congress. The extent to which the president may exercise military power independently of Congress and the scope of the War Powers Resolution remain unresolved. Constitutional issues. Although all presidents since its passage have complied with the terms of the resolution while maintaining that they are not constitutionally required to do so, President Truman issued 907 executive orders, with 1081 orders by Theodore Roosevelt, 1203 orders by Calvin Coolidge, and 1803 orders by Woodrow Wilson. Franklin D. Roosevelt has the distinction of making record 3,522 executive orders. Franklin Roosevelt, prior to 1932, uncontested executive orders had determined such issues as national mourning on the death of a president, and the lowering of flags to half-star. President Franklin Roosevelt issued the first of his more than 3,500 executive orders on March 6, 1933, declaring a bank holiday, forbidding banks to release gold coin or bullion. Executive Order 6102 forbade the hoarding of gold coin, bullion and gold certificates. A further executive order required all newly mined domestic gold be delivered to the Treasury. By Executive Order 6581, the President created the Export-Import Bank of the United States. On March 7, 1934, he created the National Industrial Recovery Act. On June 29, the President issued Executive Order 6763, under the authority vested in me by the Constitution, thereby creating the National Labor Relations Board. The Hughes Court of the 1934 term found the National Industrial Recovery Act unconstitutional. The President then issued Executive Order 7073, by virtue of the authority vested in me under the said Emergency Relief Appropriation Act of 1935, re-establishing the National Emergency Council to administer the functions of the NERA in carrying out the provisions of the Emergency Relief Appropriations Act. On June 15, he issued Executive Order 7075, which terminated NERA and replaced it with the Office of Administration of the National Recovery Administration. Roosevelt's Supreme Court of Justices Hugo Black, Stanley Reed, Felix Frankfurter, William O. Douglas, Frank Murphy and James A. Burns was sympathetic to the president's choices. Only George Washington had had such influence over court appointments, choosing all of its original members. Criticisms. Large policy changes with wide-ranging effects have been effected through executive order, including the racial integration of the armed forces under Harry Truman and the desegregation of public schools under Dwight Dwight D. Eisenhower. Two extreme examples of an executive order are Franklin Roosevelt's Executive Order 6102, forbidding the hoarding of gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates within the continental United States, and Executive Order 9066, where Roosevelt delegated military authority to remove any or all people in a military zone. The authority delegated to General John L. DeWitt subsequently paved the way for all Japanese Americans on the West Coast to be sent to internment camps for the duration of World War II. Executive Order 13233, issued by President George W. Bush in 2001, which restricted public access to the papers of former presidents, was criticized by the Society of American Archivists and other groups, who stated that it violates both the spirit and letter of existing U.S. law on access to presidential papers as clearly laid down in 44 U.S.C. 2201-07, and adding that the order potentially threatens to undermine one of the very foundations of our nation. President Obama revoked Executive Order 13233 in January 2009. The Heritage Foundation has accused presidents of abusing executive orders, of using them to make laws without congressional approval, and of moving existing laws away from their original mandates. Legal conflicts. In 1935, the Supreme Court overturned 5 of President Franklin Roosevelt's executive orders. Executive Order 12954, issued by President Clinton in 1995, attempted to prevent the federal government from contracting with organizations that had strikebreakers on the payroll. A federal appeals court subsequently ruled that the order conflicted with the National Labor Relations Act, and invalidated the order. President Clinton's Executive Order 13155 was also overturned. This order required federal benefits and services to be provided in foreign languages. This order was overturned by the Supreme Court, Alexander v. Sandoval 532 U.S. 275, on April 24, 2001. Congress has the power to overturn an executive order by passing legislation in conflict with it. Congress can also refuse to provide funding necessary to carry out certain policy measures contained with the order or to legitimize policy mechanisms. In the former, the President retains the power to veto such a decision. However, the Congress may override a veto with a two-thirds majority to end an executive order. It has been argued that a congressional override of an executive order is a nearly impossible event due to the supermajority vote required and the fact that such a vote leaves individual lawmakers very vulnerable to political criticism. On July 30, 2014, the Republican-led House of Representatives approved a resolution authorizing Speaker John Boehner to sue President Barack Obama over claims he exceeded his executive authority in changing a key provision of the Affordable Care Act on his own and over what Republicans claimed had been inadequate enforcement of the health care law, which Republican lawmakers opposed. In particular, Republicans objected that the Obama administration delayed some parts of the law, particularly the mandate on employers who do not provide health care coverage. The suit was filed in the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia on November 21, 2014. State governors' executive orders. Executive orders as issued by the governors of the states are not statutes like those passed by state legislatures, but have the force of law in a similar way to the federal system. Executive orders are usually based on existing constitutional or statutory powers of the governor and do not require any action by the state legislature to take effect. Executive orders may, for example, demand budget cuts from state government when the state legislature is not in session, and economic conditions take a downturn, thereby decreasing tax revenue below what was forecast when the budget was approved. Depending on the state constitution, a governor may specify by what percentage each government agency must reduce by, and may exempt those that are already particularly underfunded, or cannot put long-term expenses off until a later fiscal year. The governor may also call the legislature into a special session. There are also other uses for gubernatorial executive orders. In 2007, for example, the governor of Georgia made an executive order for all of its state agencies to reduce water use during a major drought. This was also demanded of its county's water systems, however, it is unclear whether this would have the force of law. Presidential proclamation. According to political science professor Philip J. Cooper, a presidential proclamation states a condition, declares a law and requires obedience, recognizes an event or triggers the implementation of a law. Presidents define situations or conditions on situations that become legal or economic truth. These orders carry the same force of law as executive orders. The difference between the two is that executive orders are aimed at those inside government, while proclamations are aimed at those outside government. The administrative weight of these proclamations is upheld because they are often specifically authorized by congressional statute, making them delegated unilateral powers. Presidential proclamations are often dismissed as a practical presidential tool for policy making because of the perception of proclamations as largely ceremonial or symbolic in nature. However, the legal weight of presidential proclamations suggests their importance to presidential governance.